Content warning. This video contains discussion of multiple ethnic and racial slurs. Some of them will be appearing on screen, some will have audio footage of other people saying them, and there are a few that I will be saying aloud given the context they appear in. The decisions on how to include each slur have been made with caution and consideration. I apologize in advance if this video causes offense. This is a sensitive topic, and I am addressing it as best as I am able. In 1950, a chorus member in the Broadway musical Gentlemen Prefer Blondes sent a dressing gown to a friend who was performing in the ensemble of Call Me Madam. After receiving the gown, they attached a feather from Ethel Merman's costume before sending the gown to another Broadway ensemble performer in the cast of Guys and Dolls. The robe continued to be passed from performer to performer across Broadway until it was retired at the end of the season, covered in mementos from the shows that had opened that year. Over time, the practice continued, eventually being formalized into a tradition that continues to this day. On the opening night of every Broadway musical with a chorus, the member of the ensemble with the most Broadway chorus credits will be anointed as the next recipient of the robe. After having everyone touch the robe for good luck, they add a small patch or accent, holding onto the robe until the next musical opens, whereupon it's passed along to a new chorus member. This tradition, overseen by Actors Equity, is known today as the Legacy Robe, but prior to 2018, it had a different name.
These are just a few incarnations of the Gypsy Robe, the name for a garment that's a Broadway institution.
When the news broke about the renaming, not everyone agreed with Equity about the necessity for the change. Many an angry comment was left in the Broadway World message boards, with people proclaiming the decision as moronic, laughable, ridiculous, a picayune gesture at best, and asinine and absolutely over-the-top PC. But perhaps one comment stands out as the most prophetic.
What next? Are they going to change the name of Gypsy of the Year? Or change the name of the musical Gypsy?
The first example they referred to is a fundraiser hosted by Broadway Cares Equity Fights AIDS, which brings Broadway and off-Broadway performers together to raise millions of dollars each December. And as it turns out, the event would be renamed later that year as the Red Bucket Follies, a name it retains to this day. As for the second example they gave, well, that's what this video is about. The musical in question barely needs any introduction. Written by Arthur Lawrence, Jules Stein, and Stephen Sondheim, and debuting on Broadway in 1959, it's one of the only musicals to be revived 4 times on Broadway, with career milestone performances from Ethel Merman, Angela Lansbury, Tyne Daly, Bernadette Peters, and Patti LuPone. Numerous critics have heralded it as one of the greatest musicals ever written. There are major regional productions of it every single season. It ushered the phrase "everything is coming up roses" into the vernacular. Several of its songs have become standards, and it did it all with a title that Merriam-Webster defines as increasingly understood as offensive. Because, if I may jump straight to the thesis of this video, I think that anonymous commenter from 2018 was correct. Perhaps the next step is to give this musical a new title. Now, a couple of things I need to clarify right out of the gate. Do I have the authority to unilaterally make this change happen? No, I absolutely do not. I am one video essayist that doesn't even have enough subscribers to monetize my content. Am I calling for the musical to be cancelled and never performed? No, far from it. The show has earned its title as one of the best for a good reason, and I wouldn't rob future performers of one of the best roles for older actresses. Am I advocating for the show to be completely rewritten for modern sensitivities? Not at all. In the entirety of the show's libretto, I am calling for a single word to be changed, and it's the one on the title page. Everything else can stay the same. Now, given the polarization of everything, I imagine you've already sorted yourself into one of 2 camps. On one hand, the people fully supportive of potentially changing the name of this musical to something that's not a recognized ethnic slur. And on the other hand, the people who think this is a misguided move to erase theater history just because a couple of people they've never met are allegedly upset by it. And hey, listen, if you're reflexively resistant to changing the name of the Mama Rose musical, then this video is absolutely for you. The thing is, given how often the show plays on Broadway, the most recent revival being 14 years ago means we're actually due for another revival by this point. And given the recent adjustments to the titles of the Legacy Robe and the Red Bucket Follies, I can almost guarantee that the next time this show gets revived, with presumably Audra McDonald as Mama Rose, there's gonna be capital D discourse about putting this title on a Broadway marquee. And trying to have this conversation while that revival is barreling towards performances will be messy and unproductive. So here, in the time before there's a major revival of this musical on the horizon, I want to quickly run through a bunch of arguments for why the title of this musical should not be changed, and give each of them a fair and measured response. Because, to put it as directly as possible, we really should change the title. Argument 1. Okay, but is that word actually a slur? So, the origins of the term go back centuries, but it was created and is still used today in reference to the Romani, a diasporic ethnic group with roots in India that now live around the world. The largest populations of the Romani are in Central and Southern Europe, Southwestern Asia, and the Americas. As a diasporic group, there's no central location where the Romani come from. Many of them take up residence in communities and build lives among their neighbors, while others are itinerant, traveling from place to place without settling down in one location. Importantly, the Romani are not a homogeneous group. There are more than 24 different subgroups and populations, each shaped by the countries and cities where they choose to build a life. They have their own language, their own cuisine, their own traditions. Look, I don't need to recite the entire Wikipedia entry on Romani people. It's an ethnic group without a defined homeland, a complex tapestry of people filled with history and pride and contradictions. And the term at the center of this video was created to take all that culture and smash it down into a flat stereotype. The slur itself conjures up images of Romani lifestyle that entered the public consciousness through mass media. Thieves and mystics, fortune-telling, passionate romantics, people on the outskirts of polite society. The term itself comes from the word Egyptian, which many Western Europeans assumed was the true origin of the ethnic group. The Romani have been frequently targeted for ethnic persecution since the Middle Ages, and especially since the 17th century, the term gained increased usage as a pejorative term for the whole of the Romani population and culture. This video does not have the time to go into the whole history of the persecution of the Romani people. No video essay of this length could do that. But the important thing to know is, at the first World Romani Congress, the assembled delegates voted unanimously to ban the term, calling it derogatory. And that was in 1971. To the question, then, of whether the G word is truly a slur, yeah, it just definitely is. Now, when you do some research into the term and its usage in the modern day, you're likely to find articles that mention how some Romani people have reclaimed the slur, who use it proudly to refer to themselves and their culture. And here's the thing. People from historically marginalized communities are allowed to reclaim terms for themselves. However, importantly, reclamation of slurs is something that happens within communities who are targets of the slur. Very rarely are people from outside of the affected community allowed to casually use the term, and almost never in reference to an aesthetic rather than a culture. A member of the Romani community finding pride in referring to themselves with the slur is not equal in impact to 3 white writers using the word as the title for a musical that has nothing to do with the Romani. You can't reclaim a term that was never leveled at you in the first place. Of course, some people would hear that counter-argument and respond. Argument 2. The musical isn't named after the Romani, it's named after the stripper. This is another argument brought up in that Broadway World thread to argue that the name change for the Legacy Robe wouldn't need to happen for the musical. But I don't think it's an argument that actually works. Now, the stripper in question, whose life became the basis for the musical, is named Gypsy Rose Lee. And if you're wondering why I just used the term after avoiding it up to this point, it's because of a thing called context. Gypsy Rose Lee is the stage name of the performer Rose Louise Hovick, and as a performer who is no longer with us, her name can be contextualized in light of the time period when she performed. Sometimes proper nouns and historical names contain slurs within them, which, in order to discuss them, require their usage. However, the difference between using them in the context of a title and using them individually is huge. As a historian, I'd have no issue saying the name of the baseball organization, the Negro Leagues, the U.S. Immigration Policy, Operation Wetback, or the Oregon-based dance rock band, the Slants. But if I used any of the contained slurs individually to refer to any of the participants in those historical events, then we would have a problem. Similarly, it's one thing to refer to Gypsy Rose Lee with what was her full historic stage name. It's another to chop the last 2 words off and append only the first as the title of a musical. And yes, it was also the title of her autobiography, but the word isn't on a marquee because of the book, it's because of the musical. To clarify, the character of Louise, who becomes Gypsy Rose Lee in the musical, does not have to change her name to something else. It doesn't have to be Romani Rose Lee or anything like that. It's a historical name. albeit a troubling one, as her autobiography indicates that she chose to add the first word in her name because it was in the title of the music she was already performing to, not out of any relation or kinship with the Romani. But again, within the musical, the name can stay the same. If you were writing a musical about the Negro Leagues, you would use the historic name. But if a trio of white writers had titled that musical with only the first word of their historic name, that would be very different. But perhaps that brings us to Argument 3. It's not what the creators would have wanted. First of all, as a general thought, this argument is a weak one. As all three of the authors of this musical have passed away, it implies a sort of ventriloquizing of the deceased, making them say exactly what we want them to say. Yes, they have estates or trusts, but the estates didn't write the musical. The men did, and they don't care. They are dead. It's also an open enough argument that it can be thrown right back into someone's face. If you say that the creators wouldn't have approved, I can reply that they would have. You can't prove either argument. It may as well be paraphrased as, I like to pretend the creators would share my opinion. But getting around the syntax of the statement, the idea at the heart of it is that we shouldn't alter the script in ways that go against the intention of the musical. And to that I say, why does this musical need to have this title? I agree, it does have this title, but why does it need to? Shakespeare tells us that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, so would this musical not have the same emotional resonance under a different title? In my earlier video on The Drowsy Chaperone, I posited a division of the arts into two categories, static and dynamic. To summarize, static art is the sort of art that exists in a particular form when it's first created, and holds that same form over time. Mediums like literature, recorded music, photographs, and sculpture. Dynamic art, however, must be performed in order to exist, or else it's only a set of instructions or blueprints. Mediums like dance, puppetry, culinary arts, and theater. Applied to this musical, it would mean that the Mama Rose musical doesn't technically exist when not being performed. The script and score do, as well as cast recordings and other ephemera of performance. But the musical itself, the thing that people are nostalgic for, is ephemeral. You can't watch it unless someone is performing it. Dynamic art also requires consistent endorsement from artists, who must be comfortable enough with the artwork in question to continually bring it to life on stage. Adjustments made to material that has aged poorly stem from attempts on the part of the artists to create a version of the dynamic artwork that remains endorsable today. Works of dynamic art that no one wants to endorse anymore aren't performed, and as such, fade away. Which is a long way of saying the following. Wouldn't it show greater respect to the creators of this musical to make this change to the title, in service of assuring that their work can continue to be endorsed and performed far into the future? The changing of the titles for the Legacy Robe and the Red Bucket Follies are big indications to me of the direction that Actors Equity, and the industry in general, are heading towards with regards to the slur itself. As new generations grow more wary of the G word, a musical with that title will only become less and less enticing, no matter how good the content within is. Don't think of changing the title of this musical as erasing history. Think of it as ensuring that it has a future. Of course, you could respond to that hypothetical with Argument 4. There aren't enough people who care about this. This statement could be read one of two ways, so we're going to respond to each in turn. Firstly, there's the conversation about the relatively minor voice of the Romani within American culture. 1 million Roma are estimated to live in the US, or 0.003% of the population. Should we really make this major adjustment to the musical's title just because it may upset a portion of that small slice of the population? And to that I say, why not? Genuinely, why not? Who would be actively harmed by the title of this musical changing? No one would. People would be upset by it, for sure, but no one would be actively victimized by it changing. But there are people who are harmed by keeping it as is, since it normalizes a word that they've considered a slur for more than 50 years. Changing it wouldn't be a win-lose situation, it would be a win-neutral. As for the other side of the not enough people care argument, there's the sense that this has only become an issue in the Western world recently. That rather than making a big change in response to a recent swell of activism, we should ride out the complaints until the public anger dies down again. It's a gentler perspective, similar to the one that many companies took in the summer of 2020. It's also willfully ignorant. Yes, when this musical was revived on Broadway in 2008, there were no hand-wringing think pieces about the appropriateness of the title. Neither were there in 2015 when it was revived on the West End, or in 2018 when the Munis staged it. But to act like this is an issue that's going to die down at some point ignores the general cultural trend towards being more careful about the origins of the language we use. It's the reason people are discouraged from using all these phrases, because as language evolves, certain phrases that were once considered appropriate are reconsidered for their harmful origin. Consider practically which course of action is easier: changing the title of this musical for future productions, or convincing an entire younger generation that the slur against the Romani is not actually harmful. As another classic musical, and even older one, once said,
"Countries are changing, I gotta change with it."
It is highly unlikely, God willing, that there will be some cultural reset at some point where the general population decides they're fine using offensive language again. Once people realize that a term is offensive, they don't tend to go back to using it at some later date. The conversation around people who never stopped using it is a separate issue. It may be true that the average American at present doesn't see the G word as inappropriate to use in conversation, but the name change doesn't have to be just a response to public opinion. It could be a way of shaping public opinion. A way of leading by example, of being a loud voice pointing in the direction that culture has been heading for decades. In short, if the argument is that the title shouldn't change because not enough people care about the issue, I would say it's the lack of general recognition of the word's harmful impact that should encourage us to make the change, particularly on a very public, well-known show that gets produced with some regularity. Then again, that regularity might result in even more pushback because, argument 5, we can't change the title of a classic musical after 60 years. Like before, there are really two issues at play here. As to the issue of the musical being a classic, I have many follow-up questions. How famous does a musical need to be locked in amber and never adjusted? How many regional productions, and I do want an actual number, how many regional productions does a classical musical need to have annually in order to justify having a title that is a recognized racial slur? This musical debuted in 1959, so it's been around for 63 years. Would it have been okay to change the title 5 years after it premiered? Or 10? Or 20? If the argument is that it's been too long, how long is brief enough? But maybe the argument here is less focused on the classic and more on the can't. Practically speaking, can you actually change the title of a musical after it's been on Broadway? Plenty of musicals change their titles during or just after their original run, including Drood, the SpongeBob musical, Halftime, Bad Cinderella, and the various titles that eventually led to Weidman and Sondheim's Roadshow. But in all those cases, the title change happened before the musical was licensed and locked in place. Is there an example of a musical changing its title years after it was published? Yes. There is one. In 1963, Meredith Willson, playwright of The Music Man, wrote a musical adaptation of the film Miracle on 34th Street, which had a brief run on Broadway. Following its debut, it was published for licensing with its Broadway title, Here's Love. And while it could never have been called a success, there were occasional regional productions of the show throughout the late 20th century, with two of the largest being at the Toronto Civic Light Opera in the mid-2000s. But sometime between 2007 and 2014, the name of the show was changed, being rechristened as Miracle on 34th Street the Musical, a title under which the show has seen a boost in contemporary productions. The differences between Here's Love and the Mama Rose musical are numerous, obviously. No one particularly cared about Here's Love, while the other musical has been a Tony-winning hit throughout its entire history. And the name change to Miracle on 34th Street wasn't motivated by growing audience discomfort with the name Here's Love, but, one suspects, more from the desire to rebrand the show with a recognizable IP. Still, the practical example does exist, a musical from the mid-century being renamed after 50 years by people who were not the original author. It can be done. Not to mention the examples that can be found outside of theater. Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None was changed from a pretty offensive title, which was itself changed from an extremely offensive title. For a more contemporary example, the Black Eyed Peas released this single in 2003, only to then create an album-only clean edit of the song, which grew in popularity to the point that, earlier this year, it replaced the offensive version as the album's third track on streaming services. And let's not forget the football team, the Washington Commanders, or the baseball team, the Cleveland Guardians, both very public examples. I mean, Jesus, folks, we renamed a mountain. I could go on with example after example, but the point is, yes, it is possible to change the title of this musical. I will admit, there is no perfect precedent for the situation we have with the Mama Rose musical, a script considered an absolute classic whose title is unambiguously a racial slur. But lack of precedent doesn't mean that we have to do nothing. We can do things even without precedent. We can do the right thing even if we've never had to do this particular right thing before. Unless you are fully adamant that this is not the right thing to do, in which case you fall back on the final argument. Argument 6. I don't want to. Tough. I don't mean to play down the significance of changing this musical's title. It would be a major change that would likely anger a lot of people. Particularly older theater fans who don't want to be reminded of the problematic elements of musicals they've grown up loving. Again, see the Drowsy video for a longer discussion of that.
Oh, it's a slap in the face to 4,000 years of Chinese history. But it had some wonderful tunes.
Unlike listening to the album in private, producing a musical is invariably a public action. It's one thing to use the slur within the show, as part of the historically rooted name of a character. It's another thing to slap the word on billboards, programs, season brochures, ticketing emails, and resumes. Gypsy Rose Lee, as she exists in the show, can be contextualized in the 1940s. But putting the name of this show on a marquee is something that happens in the perpetual present. Even if the first time we put it there was a long time ago, it's only ever going to be in the present day from this point forward. Is this the most pressing issue within musical theater today? Oh god, absolutely not. This isn't even the only issue within musical theater involving this word. The conversation on the word's usage in Disney's The Hunchback of Notre Dame, for example, is massively complex. The presence of Romani characters, the depiction of them as thieves and mystics, the 1996 film it's beholden to follow, the lack of a Broadway production to serve as the model. I have no interest in doing a video essay on how we excise the G word from Hunchback because I have no goddamn clue how to do it. The reason I'm making this video, then, is because the issue with the Mama Rose musical is so much easier than that. Easier to recognize the issue, easier to come to a consensus on, and easier to action a solution. If I may simplify my long argument down to 2 sentences so you can take it and make this argument yourself, it would be this. There are only 2 options for what we do with the title of this musical. We change it, or we don't change it. Both of those are choices that we are making as a theater community, and I personally feel that not changing it at this point is irresponsible. What we change it to and how we go about changing it, those are valid concerns and ones that will invite and require fervent discussion. But they're not conversations we can have until we agree on this central point. The title of the 1959 musical, Gypsy, must be changed. As an artistic industry that loves to loudly praise itself for its progressivism, this is a chance to prioritize the future of musical theater over our veneration of its past, and I sincerely hope we do it before the next Broadway revival. Which, now that I think about it, let's actually have Sharon D. Clarke as Rose.